The Buddha's Adventures in America. The man in orange shoes. He arrived quietly. No thunder in the sky, no light breaking through clouds. No one noticed when he stepped off the bus in a small town nestled between long flat fields of wheat and silence. The only thing unusual was his shoes. Soft canvas, painted a brilliant shade of orange, glowing gently like sunrise caught in cloth. He wore simple clothes, loose linen pants, a soft grey shirt, and a satchel slung over one shoulder. His skin was the colour of earth and weather, ageless. His eyes held the stillness of moonlight reflected in a pond. He walked without urgency, without direction, yet each step fell as if he had always meant to be there. He was not called Buddha, not in this age. People called him the quiet man, the walker, that smiling guy who eats just one apple. But to some, especially those who stayed still long enough, he was something else, a whisper of a deeper rhythm beneath the noise. The first place he stopped was a roadside diner, where tired truckers drank bitter coffee and waitresses moved like swaying pendulums. The bell above the door rang as he entered, and no one looked up. He took a booth in the corner, placed his satchel on the floor, and sat as if the act of sitting were holy. He did not order, he just smiled, and somehow, without asking, a waitress named Martha brought him a small plate of toast and an apple. She wasn't sure why she did it, only that it felt right. "You look like someone who's been walking a long time," she said, curious but not pressing. He nodded slowly. His silence didn't seem awkward. It filled the space like soft sunlight. "You from around here?" she asked again. Still, he said nothing, but he looked at her, not into her, not through her, but with her, and something in her chest unclenched. She left his table quieter than she came. In the following days, he walked. He walked along highways, beside cornfields, through suburbs and alleys, through parks where children laughed and old men fed pigeons. He slept wherever the world offered a resting place, under a sycamore tree, behind a church, once inside a bus-stop shelter where the neon buzzed like a tired mosquito. He didn't beg, he didn't preach, but wherever he paused, a hush followed. One day, in a town where trains still passed but never stopped, he sat on the steps of an abandoned factory. A man named Terry approached him. Terry had fought in 2 wars and carried more ghosts than stories. "You're not afraid of being alone here?" Terry asked. The man in the orange shoes didn't answer. He only extended a hand. Not to shake, not to offer anything. Just open. Terry sat down beside him. They watched the dust swirl in the wind. After a long time, Terry whispered, "I haven't slept without a bottle in my hand for 12 years. The man looked at him, eyes soft and wide, and Terry began to cry. Not loudly, not brokenly, just a quiet leak from a long-sealed place. The next day, Terry threw away his bottle. No one told him to. But something in the silence had shifted him. In another town, bigger, noisier, the man stood near a school playground. He watched the children chase each other like birds in flight. One of them ran up to him, giggling. "Are you a monk?" Or a magician? She asked. He crouched down, placed his hand on her head, and smiled. Mum says don't talk to strangers, she added. Still, she didn't run. Instead, she pulled a daisy from her pocket, already wilted, and handed it to him. This is magic, she whispered. He bowed as he accepted it, and from then on she left a flower there every morning, placing it on the fence where he once stood. He didn't return, but her mother noticed she had fewer nightmares after that. In each place, he stayed only long enough for someone to feel just a bit more awake. A grocer started giving bruised fruit to homeless people instead of throwing it away. A retired teacher began planting herbs in front of the library. A young man deleted the cruel comment he'd typed on his phone. None of them knew why. None of them saw the man again. But something quiet had passed through them, like wind through trees, like a bell rung miles away, whose echo still moved the air. He was not in a hurry. He had nowhere to go. And yet, he walked from town to town, city to city, always arriving at the exact moment someone forgot how to breathe. The coffee shop and the storm. The city was loud. Lights blinked even at midnight. Horns were not questions but demands. People moved with their shoulders tightened, their jaws clenched, their steps fast and unfinished. But in the middle of that endless hum, there was a park. And at the edge of that park, just beneath a tree that had seen more seasons than smiles, the quiet man sat cross-legged. He did not watch his phone. He did not take a photo. He simply watched the people who were trying not to be watched. A woman passed him, holding a briefcase too tightly and speaking into a headset. She didn't see him, but 2 steps later she stopped. Something in her chest tugged. She turned her head slightly, saw him. Their eyes met for less than a breath, and still, she exhaled in a way she hadn't in weeks. That was all. But that breath, unguarded and deep, was like water to a drought inside her. She didn't know why, but later that night, she cancelled a meeting she didn't want and went home to read to her child. The man continued to walk. He passed a church, then a bookstore, then a row of buildings with graffiti like prayers, sprayed in anger and colour. He walked past sirens, screens, and 1,000 urgent footsteps, but the sound never disturbed the stillness he carried with him. Eventually he entered a small coffee shop, dimly lit, half empty, smelling of roasted beans and unspoken questions. The barista was a young man, with a tired look behind his eyes. He had dreams once, dreams of painting, of wild forests, of love not yet named, but now he stood behind the counter, repeating, "For here or to go," like a bell tolling for things not done. When the quiet man entered, he simply stood there, smiling. "Can I help you?" the barista asked, though something in him already softened. The man pointed to the empty tip jar, then to the barista's chest, then gently tapped his own heart with 2 fingers. The young man didn't understand, not with his mind, but his throat tightened. He poured a small black coffee and set it down. "No charge," he whispered. The man bowed slightly and took the cup to a corner table, where he sat with such presence that even the steam from his cup seemed to settle more slowly. He sat there for hours. People came and went. Some noticed him. Most didn't. But those who did left with something they didn't have before. Not money, not advice, just a sense that maybe they weren't so alone in the world. Rain began to fall. Not hard, not angry, just steady, like the sky had remembered how to cry gently. A woman entered, soaked at the edges, her hair pulled into a knot of fatigue. She ordered a tea, found a seat near the man, and after a while turned to him and said, "I don't know why I'm sad." He looked at her, not to fix, not to explain, just to be with her in the weight of it. Then, after a pause, he slid his cup across the table toward her. It was still warm. He didn't drink, but she placed both her hands around it and closed her eyes. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel she had to carry it all alone. That night, the man walked through the rain. He stopped to help an old man whose groceries had spilled into the gutter. He knelt to tie the shoe of a boy waiting with his father at the bus stop. He stood for 5 full minutes at a crosswalk, simply watching the way puddles formed their own worlds on the concrete. And then he kept walking. Some people posted pictures of him online. "Anyone seen this guy? He gave me his umbrella and just walked away. Didn't say a word, but made me feel like I'd been heard. Saw this dude in orange shoes just standing in the rain, eyes closed, peaceful as hell, but no one ever found him again in the same place. He was always already elsewhere. Some said he was a wandering saint. Others thought he was part of some social experiment. A few believed he was just a man with nothing left to lose. But those who felt his presence knew otherwise. He wasn't trying to teach. He wasn't trying to save. He wasn't even trying to be anything at all. He was just being, and that was enough to change people. The man with no mirror. In the desert plains of New Mexico, where roads stretch like thoughts across an endless horizon, the quiet man walked with his sandals thin from the miles. His orange shoes, once vivid as dawn, were now softened with dust, but still glowed faintly in the evening sun. The land was wide here, so wide that time seemed to fall apart. Even the wind had space to wander without aim. The silence was heavier than noise. He walked into a town where most of the houses leaned inward, as if tired of being held up by memory. The windows wore old newspapers like shrouds. There were more boarded doors than open ones. And yet, in the center of it all was a barber shop still open. A striped pole spun slowly, humming a tired lullaby. Inside, the barber, a man named Roy, sat alone, trimming his own nails with a small pair of scissors. He was in his 70s and hadn't had a customer in days. When the doorbell rang and the quiet man stepped inside, Roy didn't ask questions. "You need a trim," he said, out of habit. The man sat in the chair and nodded gently. Roy began, combing through hair that seemed both ancient and new, like it had grown in another lifetime. "You know," Roy said, "most folks think this town's dead. The man didn't answer. Roy snipped carefully, breathing slowly. "But I think it's just sleeping. Kinda like people. Sometimes we're not broken, we're just resting too long." Still, the man said nothing. Roy smiled to himself. "You're a good listener, like the desert. It doesn't talk, but it hears everything." When he finished, he offered the man a mirror. The man didn't take it. Instead, he looked at Roy and bowed once, deep and grateful. Roy didn't charge. He didn't even think to. When the man left, he swept the floor more slowly than usual, his chest feeling a little lighter than it had in years. Outside, a boy sat on the curb with a harmonica, playing a wandering tune. The man stopped, crouched beside him, and listened. "You got any requests?" the boy asked. The man just smiled. So the boy played whatever came to mind, notes falling like small leaves. When he finished, the man placed a single feather in the boy's lap, white and soft. "That's weird," the boy said, but he kept it anyway. Later, when the boy's mother came out to call him home, she noticed he wasn't twitching like usual. His body, always anxious, was calm. "What happened?" she asked. He shrugged. "Some guy with quiet eyes gave me a feather." That night, he slept without a nightmare, for the first time in months. Farther down the road, the man found a small church, long since closed, its pews empty, its doors unlocked. He stepped inside and sat in the back, beneath a stained glass window, of a saint whose name had been forgotten by even the pastor. He sat there through the night. A man named Javier wandered in, drunk and full of anger. He stumbled down the aisle, yelling at no one in particular, angry at God, at the world, at the broken promises he kept giving himself. When he saw the figure in the back, he stopped. "You judging me?" he slurred. The man said nothing. Javier walked up to him, his breath thick with beer and pain. "You just like all the others? Think I'm a waste?" The man looked at him, not with pity, not with fear, but with a stillness that disarmed everything Javier had built around his hurt. Javier sat down beside him, the weight of silence swallowing his rage. He wept for a long time. By dawn, he had fallen asleep leaning against the pew. When he woke, the man was gone, but on the bench beside him was a folded napkin with a single word written in pencil. Enough. Javier carried that word in his wallet from then on. He stopped drinking 2 weeks later. No one quite believed him when he said it wasn't a miracle, just a moment. But he believed it. The man walked again, along cracked sidewalks, over bridges no longer used, through fields where windmills spun like prayer wheels in the breeze. He paused to watch birds rise from telephone wires. He shared bread with a man living under a tarp. He offered no lectures, only warmth. People often tried to understand him. Some thought he was a prophet, others a silent monk performing penance. A few believed he was a ghost, but those who encountered him learned that understanding was not the point. Presence was. Being with him was like being near a still pond after a storm. You saw yourself more clearly, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. That In a grocery store, a cashier dropped a jar and it shattered. She winced, expecting reprimand. But the man knelt beside her, began gathering the shards one by one as if each piece were sacred. She didn't speak. He didn't either. When he was done, he bowed and left, and she realized her hands had stopped shaking. And on he walked, the man who didn't answer questions. He walked north, into forests older than highways, past cabins with chipped paint and wind chimes singing to no one. Birds circled overhead, not as omens or signs, but simply because the sky was wide. He stopped in a town wrapped in pine trees and silence, one of those places where people came to get away, but often brought their noise with them. There, in a little town square, stood a wooden bench beside a stone fountain. The water didn't shoot or sparkle. It simply spilled gently from the mouth of a copper fish. The quiet man sat on the bench and watched. A teenager sat down next to him. His hoodie was pulled over his head. He had earbuds in, but no music playing. He glanced sideways at the stranger, annoyed. "You like watching fountains or something?" he mumbled. The man smiled. The boy scowled. "People like you always act like everything's peaceful, but it's not. The world's messed up." No reply. "Don't you care?" The man turned slightly, not to confront, not to teach, just to be present. His eyes were not filled with answers, just listening. The boy pulled out one earbud and scoffed. "You think being silent makes things better?" Still, the man did not speak, and after a while, the boy stopped asking questions. He just sat there, quietly, breathing. A few feet away a dog barked once, and then went still. The trees shifted slightly, as if adjusting their posture. The boy eventually stood, tugging at his sleeves. "I don't get you." The man looked up and nodded, his eyes soft and warm. "Oh, thanks, I guess," the boy added, almost inaudibly, and left. Not long after, a woman approached the same bench. Her eyes were red, and she clutched her phone like a lifeline. "Can I ask you something?" she said. The man blinked gently. "My mom, she died last week, and everyone keeps telling me it gets better, that time will help. But it doesn't, it just spreads, like the pain is stretching to fill everything." The man listened. "I keep thinking I should have done more, been there more, said something different." She waited for comfort, an answer, a phrase she could wrap around her grief. But he didn't speak. He only looked at her with such softness that her heart, which had hardened from too many condolences, cracked open again. "I just want her to know I'm sorry," she whispered. The man placed his palm over his heart and bowed his head. That was all, and somehow it was enough. She didn't feel healed, but she felt less alone. She returned the next day to thank him, but he was gone. He had walked east now, where lakes held the sky like mirrors, and small towns blinked awake in morning fog. He stopped in a place called Summerfield, though it was spring. There, in a community center, people were setting up chairs for a meditation class. He walked in, uninvited but not unwelcome. The instructor, a well-meaning man in his 40s, was reciting a passage from a book titled Stillness as Success. So remember, friends, breath is the key. Breath and intention. Find your center. Picture it as a calm lake. The quiet man sat in the back, legs crossed, eyes open. The instructor paused. "Ah, sir, are you joining us?" The man smiled but didn't move. "We'll begin with 10 minutes of guided silence," the instructor said, a little thrown off. 10 minutes passed, but in that room it felt like more. The instructor found himself speaking more slowly. The fidgeters stopped fidgeting. A woman who had never been able to close her eyes during meditation finally did, and the silence that followed felt not like an absence, but like a presence. When the session ended, no one noticed that the man had slipped away. He was already walking again, through gravel paths, along abandoned railways, and under telephone wires where no voices travelled anymore. He stopped at a gas station and waited, while an old man argued with a clerk about the price of beef jerky. He paid for the old man's food with a handful of coins, not out of charity, but as if it were always meant to happen that way. He helped a woman lift a bag of soil into her car trunk. He picked up a piece of trash and placed it in the bin, without scolding anyone. He walked, not to arrive, but to be. The lighthouse that wasn't there. The ocean was wide and old, breathing in a rhythm deeper than words. Waves came and went like the heart does when it stops trying, somewhere along the rocky coast of Maine, where mist hangs like breath on the cliffs. The quiet man walked with salt drying on his skin. He had no destination, yet he arrived. He came to a town where the sea had once been everything: life, work, danger, and prayer. Now it was mostly scenery for tourists and wallpaper for forgotten dreams. Boats still bobbed in the harbour, but fewer hands knew how to untie them. On the edge of the town stood a lighthouse, tall, empty. The light no longer worked. It hadn't for years. It was closed to the public. Its spiral stairs rusted and wind-bitten. A plaque read, "Keep out," but the man walked to its base and sat, not defying the sign, just resting beside it. The mist curled around him like memory. A fisherman passed, balancing a plastic bucket with one hand and his weariness with the other. He glanced at the man, curious, then snorted and muttered, "Nothing up there but wind and ghosts." The man looked up at the lighthouse, then to the fisherman, then lowered his gaze, soft and slow. Later, the fisherman returned, without his bucket, without his mask of cynicism. He stood beside the man. Both watched the sea. "My brother died in a storm up there, 20 years ago." The man didn't move. "I used to come here and yell at the ocean. Thought if I screamed loud enough, I could bring him back. But now, I don't even know what he sounded like." The man reached into his satchel and pulled out a shell, small, curved like a closed eyelid. He placed it on the stone beside them. "You want me to take it?" the fisherman asked. The man shook his head. "It's not for me." The man simply stood and walked back toward the town. The fisherman stared after him, then sat down and placed the shell against his ear. He didn't hear the sea. but he remembered his brother's laugh, and that was more than enough. Farther inland, in a town called Whitestone, where factories hummed like bees in cages and people blinked too fast, the man arrived at a community bus stop. It was raining, soft, steady, without malice. The girl, maybe 7 years old, was huddled beneath the shelter's tin roof, holding a torn drawing in her hands. It was a fine show. She looked up at him. "You smell like leaves." He smiled and sat beside her. She held up the drawing. It was a picture of a dog with wings. Mrs. Max, he flew away. The man looked closely. I drew him with wings so he wouldn't be scared." He nodded slowly, as if confirming something sacred. "Do you think dogs get lonely when they go?" The man didn't answer, but after a long moment, he reached into his satchel again and drew out a small piece of smooth bark. Upon it was etched the faint outline of a paw print. The girl gasped, "Is that Max's?" The man simply held it out to her. She clutched it like a prayer. "Thank you." She looked down, then back up. He was already gone. He travelled on, not in miles, but in moments. He passed diners where no one spoke, churches with cracked windows, schools with locked gates. He passed fields with scarecrows wearing old neckties, and abandoned motels with letters missing from their signs. And still he brought nothing but silence. Yet his silence was not empty. It was filled with attention, with the weight of presence, as if he carried not thoughts, but listening itself. People left offerings behind him, not incense or flowers, but a harmonica on a park bench, a notebook left open to a blank page, a sandwich cut in half and placed on a step, a pair of shoes beside a fountain, unlaced. He never asked for these things, but they came, and then one day, in a city crowded by ambition and noise, a woman named Alexis stopped him. She wore a sleek black coat and expensive shoes. She was holding a phone in one hand, a coffee in the other, and stress in every limb of her body. "Excuse me," she snapped. "You just made me miss my light." The man stopped. He looked at her, not defensively, not apologetically, just openly. "Are you mute or something?" she said, frustration rising. Still, he said nothing, and suddenly something about his eyes startled her. Not fear, but depth, like she had seen those eyes before, in a dream she forgot when she was 10. "He had a meeting," she said, quieter now, "a merger, a big deal." He blinked, slowly. She shifted her weight. "I don't even know why I'm telling you this." The man gently placed one finger on the corner of his own mouth and smiled. It wasn't pity, it wasn't advice, it was a smile that said, "You're allowed to stop pretending." Alexis did not go to her meeting. She walked the other way, phones silenced, and found herself in a bookstore she'd never noticed. She sat among forgotten novels and cried, for reasons she couldn't name. That night, she went home and took off her shoes without checking her emails first. The man with the paper cranes. In a grey industrial district just beyond Chicago, where loading docks sighed with rust and the wind carried the smell of burnt oil, the quiet man arrived, with dust on his cuffs and a folded piece of paper in his palm. He didn't knock. He never did. He simply stood outside an old brick warehouse where a group of young men were gathered, smoking, arguing, laughing too loudly to hide the weight they carried. Their clothes were bright, their shoes clean, their eyes guarded. One of them noticed the stranger. "Yo, who's that?" he said. Another rolled his eyes. "Just some weird old guy." But the man kept standing there, not staring, not judging, just being. "What, you want something?" one asked, stepping forward. The man bowed slightly and extended the piece of folded paper. It was a tiny crane, delicately folded, as if the paper had chosen to take flight. The boy took it. He turned it over in his hands. "What's this, man?" No answer, just a smile. He shrugged. "All right, cool bird, thanks." The others laughed. "You gonna keep that?" He didn't reply, just placed the paper crane in his jacket pocket and said, "Maybe." He didn't know why, not then, but that night, when he found his brother passed out on the floor again, he didn't shout or leave. He sat beside him, and for the first time just stayed. Quiet, and for some reason, that paper crane in his pocket felt heavier than paper. It felt like something watching gently, waiting. The quiet man moved on. In a town where a steel mill had closed but the train still screamed past, he stood at a broken bus stop where the schedule had long since faded. An old woman approached him. Her cane clicked on the sidewalk like a slow metronome. "Are you waiting for the 17?" she asked, though she didn't expect an answer. He simply nodded. "I don't think it comes anymore," she sighed. "Nothing does." She sat beside him. "You know," she whispered, "I used to be a dancer. In New York, Broadway. My name was on posters once." She smiled faintly. "People used to clap. They don't clap for old women." The man turned his head and regarded her with such kindness that it undid something behind her ribs. "I miss that feeling," she said, "of mattering, of moving like the world couldn't catch you." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a ribbon, simple, red, the kind a child might wear in her hair. He placed it in her palm. She didn't ask where it came from. She tied it around her wrist and looked at it like a stage light had flickered on somewhere far away. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's more than words." She didn't wait for the bus. She walked home, slower than before, but lighter. Later, in a neighborhood where iron fences curled like vines and dogs barked behind every gate, the man stood beside a mural. It was half finished, a woman's face, half in shadow, eyes bright and defiant. A young artist stood nearby, spray can in hand, muttering to himself. "Doesn't matter, no one looks up anyway." The man looked up, at the mural, then at the artist, then back at the wall. The artist frowned. "What, you like it?" The man said nothing. "You think I should keep going?" Still silence. But the silence felt like permission. The artist turned back to his work and painted until sunrise. In a far suburb, the man passed a small public library. Inside, a boy sat alone, reading a book upside down. Not because he didn't know how to read, but because his world had flipped itself. His parents had stopped talking. His school had stopped listening. And inside him a knot had grown. The man sat across the table from him without a word. The boy stared. "You don't even have a phone," he said. The man tilted his head. "You don't talk." The man smiled. The boy narrowed his eyes. "You some kinda monk?" Still no reply. The boy looked down at his book. He turned it the right way up, then kept reading. The man stayed for hours, saying nothing, doing nothing. But when he finally stood to leave, the boy looked up and said quietly, "Thanks for sitting with me." He didn't know why he said it, but it felt right. At dusk, the man entered a laundromat. The machines rattled like tired lungs. A woman sat beside a basket of clothes, crying quietly over a missed bus, a lost job, a son who no longer called. She looked up and saw him standing near the dryer. "You ever feel like everything just folds in on itself?" she asked, laughing bitterly. The man picked up a warm shirt from the table, folded it, then another, and another, and another, until her whole basket was neatly arranged. She watched, stunned. "Are you for real?" she said. He looked at her, eyes kind, hands still. Then he bowed and left. She stood alone, holding one of the folded shirts against her chest, like a letter that had finally been answered. And he walked on. As always, the garden no one planted. It was spring again, or at least something like it, in a city of stone and steel, where windows reflected other windows, and even the birds seemed unsure of where to land. The quiet man wandered between blocks like a breeze that no one noticed until it was gone. There was a vacant lot between two apartment buildings, just cracked pavement and a few tufts of weeds clinging to life like forgotten prayers. A rusted fence wrapped around it, its "no trespassing" sign half torn, the paint flaking like old memory. One morning, the man entered through a gap in the fence. He didn't ask permission. He knelt in the corner of the lot and began to dig, not with a shovel, but with his hands. His fingers moved the soil slowly, patiently, as though unearthing something sacred beneath the cement dust and beer caps. Passers-by stared. Some laughed. Some rolled their eyes. A boy riding past on a bicycle slowed and asked, "What are you doing?" The man looked up, smiled, and pointed to the soil. Then he reached into his satchel and pulled out a handful of seeds, tiny, dry, nearly invisible against his palm. He placed one in the ground and covered it gently. The boy frowned. "That's not gonna grow. There's no water, no sun here, just trash." The man looked at him and blinked slowly, then offered the boy a single seed. "Me?" the boy asked. The man nodded. The boy hesitated, then knelt beside him and dug with one finger. That afternoon, an old man in a nearby window watched them for a long time. The next morning, a third person joined them, a woman from the third floor who worked nights and hadn't smiled in a month. She brought a small trowel. By the end of the week, there were 7 people in that lot. A teenager brought a bag of mulch. A retired teacher brought marigold seeds. A girl drew signs with crayon. Don't step on the babies. Someone set up a rain barrel. The man never spoke. He didn't have to, and by summer, the lot had become a garden, not perfect, not organized, but full of color and laughter and pauses. A place where neighbors, once strangers, now exchanged tomatoes and stories and silence. The man had already left by then. They didn't know where, only that something had shifted, not in the ground, but in them, far away, near a mountain pass where the air thinned and trees grew in silence. The man climbed a narrow trail with no markers. He didn't bring water or maps. He walked as if gravity were a conversation, and the rocks understood him. At the top, there was an old fire tower, long since abandoned. From there, the world stretched wide and quiet. Blue ridges, cloud shadows, hawks circling in patience. He sat on the edge and closed his eyes. Hours passed. A hiker came by, a young woman, out of breath and heartbroken. She had run away from a wedding she didn't want to attend. Not her own, her sister's. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore," she said aloud to no one. The man opened his eyes and looked at her. He patted the empty space beside him. She said, "I keep pretending," she whispered, "but it's not working." The wind answered for him. After a long while, she said, "I think I'm ready to stop running." The man nodded slowly. She cried softly, not out of pain, but relief. And when she stood up to leave, she found a smooth stone where she'd been sitting. On it, a word etched in the surface. "Here." She carried it home in her pocket. In a southern city, where the air hung heavy and windows dripped with condensation, the man stopped at a train station. A young couple was arguing on the platform about bills, about broken promises, about words said wrong. The man sat nearby. He didn't interrupt. He didn't mediate. He simply looked at them when they paused. And something about the way he looked, so calm, so present, made them stop shouting. They sat in silence for a long while. The train came and went. They missed it, but they left together, holding hands. They never noticed him walking the other direction, and in a tiny roadside chapel, white-painted and leaning gently in the wind, the man lit a candle, not to pray, but to witness. He sat for an hour and left the door open behind him. A stranger walking by stepped inside. She didn't believe in anything, not gods, not fate, not even herself, but she saw the candle, and for a moment she felt like she was allowed to breathe again. That was enough. He walked as autumn began to turn the edges of trees into fire. In a park where leaves fell like slow rain, he helped a man in a wheelchair pick up a dropped book. He caught a balloon for a crying child. He tied a shoe. He paused at a pond and watched a turtle pull itself from the mud. And then he kept walking, not toward anything, but always forward. The festival without a stage. Autumn deepened. Leaves whispered as they fell. The wind grew cooler, curling between buildings like it carried news from somewhere older. In a small Appalachian town nestled in a valley surrounded by gold and amber trees, people were preparing for a harvest festival. Wooden signs painted with pumpkins and hay rides appeared on porches. Bunting hung across shop windows. It was the town's one celebration before the long, quiet winter. The quiet man arrived not with fanfare, but with a gust of leaves. No one knew who invited him. He was simply there, sitting on a bench near the square where musicians tuned their instruments and children ran between food carts with powdered sugar on their cheeks. He watched, that was all, and yet people noticed. An elderly man who hadn't danced in a decade felt his leg twitch when the fiddler struck the first chord. His wife clapped, laughing through her disbelief. A boy who never left his headphones behind took them off and listened to the music for the first time. A girl who didn't speak to strangers sat beside the quiet man and offered him a caramel apple. He didn't eat it, only held it gently, as if holding joy itself. At one point, a woman approached him. Her name was Miss Clara. She had run the bakery for 40 years, and now her hands trembled too much to frost cakes, though her mind was still sharp as cinnamon. "I've seen you," she said, "but I don't remember where." The man tilted his head, eyes twinkling like candlelight. She sat beside him, tucking her apron under her thighs. "You remind me of my father. He never said much either, but he listened like you do. People don't listen like that anymore." The man looked at her, softly, fully. She patted his hand and said, "If you need a warm roll, come by the bakery. Even if my hands shake, I still know how to make bread rise." He smiled. And that night she did bake again. 2 loaves, small, imperfect, but whole. She gave one away to the man who swept the school each morning and had never had homemade bread before. The other she left on her father's grave. She told no one about the man on the bench, but she told everyone she was ready to bake again. The quiet man moved on. In a wide stretch of farmland where the sky leaned low and crows flew in crooked lines, he passed a red barn with chipped paint and a sagging roof. Outside, a teenager sat on the tailgate of a pickup, tuning a banjo with clumsy fingers. "You don't look like you're from around here," the boy said. The man didn't respond. "That's all right. Most folks come and go. Only the fields stay." The man sat beside him. The boy strummed a few chords, badly. "I'm supposed to play at my cousin's wedding tomorrow, but I don't think I'm any good." The man didn't say otherwise. He just listened. The boy tried again and again, and the sound improved, not because of perfection, but because he stopped trying to impress and started just playing. By sunset, the boy was humming softly between notes, smiling without realizing it. When he turned to thank the stranger, the man had already vanished behind the cornrows. Later, in a city lit by billboards and headlights, the quiet man wandered into a metro station. People bustled with headphones in, eyes forward. A busker sat by the tiled wall, strumming guitar, ignored. The man sat across from him on the cold bench. The busker noticed, then shrugged. "Play for 1, play for 100. Makes no difference," he said. The man folded his hands in his lap and waited. So the musician played, not for coins, not for passers-by, but for the stillness in the stranger's gaze. He played old songs, sad ones, hopeful ones, ones that came from nowhere. People didn't stop, but they slowed, and a few dropped coins. And one woman, leaning against a pillar, closed her eyes and wept quietly, not out of sorrow, but out of something deeper. Release. When the musician finished, he looked up. The man was gone, but where he had sat, there remained a single guitar pick, carved from smooth wood, with a single word burned into it, now. And so the man moved on again. In the mountains of Colorado, he walked through frost-covered pine, in a town shaped like a postcard, where snow came early and silence held the streets at night. He entered a laundromat, where a single woman waited for her last load to finish. She had a newborn with her. The baby cried, red-faced and inconsolable. The mother rocked and sang and bounced and pleaded. Nothing worked. The man sat across from her. He didn't offer to help. He didn't reach out. He only looked, not at the crying child, but at her. Not the mother, but the person beneath the exhaustion. Her shoulders dropped. Her breath slowed. The baby's cries softened, and then, unbelievably, stopped. The child looked at the man and blinked, then nestled into her mother's chest. She looked up at him, eyes wet. "Who are you?" He bowed his head gently, and left with the snow beginning to fall. And in the middle of nowhere, where no town stood, no road curved, no map pointed, he sat under a tree alone. He closed his eyes, and for a while there was no story, just the sound of wind in grass, just being, just breath. The quiet man's gift. The quiet man travelled farther north, into a small town nestled beside a lake frozen in the first chill of winter. The air was sharp, and footsteps crunched on frosted paths. Smoke rose from chimneys in soft spirals. The town was busy preparing for the holidays, with lights strung haphazardly between telephone poles and paper snowflakes taped to windows. But beneath the cheer, many carried loneliness like heavy coats. At the edge of the town square stood an old clock tower, its hands frozen at midnight from a long-ago storm. The quiet man approached the tower and saw a young woman sitting on the cold stone steps, tears frozen on her cheeks. She was clutching a small box, worn with age. He sat beside her, silent. After a moment, she spoke, voice barely a whisper. "My grandmother gave me this. It's supposed to bring luck, but I lost my job, and now I don't know what to do." The man reached into his satchel and took out a folded piece of cloth, delicate and soft. He placed it gently in her hands. She unfolded it to find a hand-stitched pattern, a lotus flower in bloom. "Hope," she whispered. He smiled softly and bowed his head. The young woman looked up, the weight on her chest easing just a little. In the days that followed, she found small jobs, met new people, and began to smile again. And to smile. Nearby, a man with heavy steps and heavier thoughts walked the frozen sidewalks. He carried a guitar case and a notebook filled with songs no one heard. He stopped when he saw the quiet man sitting by a bench, humming a melody without words. "Do you want to hear something?" the man asked. The quiet man nodded. So he played a soft song about longing and home, about finding light in the darkest places. The man listened without interruption, eyes closed. When the song ended, the quiet man reached into his satchel and pulled out a small notebook. He handed it to the musician. Inside were blank pages, ready for new stories. The musician smiled, a smile that said thank you without words. As winter deepened, the quiet man walked through snow-dusted forests and quiet streets. He visited a hospital where a child was waiting for surgery. He stood beside a nurse who had lost hope. He touched a grandmother's hand trembling with age, but he spoke no words. Instead, his presence was the quiet balm that whispered, "You are not alone." One evening, under a sky bursting with stars, the quiet man stopped. On a frozen lake, he knelt and carved a small circle into the ice. Inside it, he placed a handful of stones, smooth and round. The wind sang softly as he sat back and closed his eyes. In the silence, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then he rose and walked on. People spoke of him in whispers and stories. A wanderer, a healer, a ghost, a man who carried stillness like a flame. But he was none of these. He was simply a traveler, walking the path of presence, a reminder that sometimes the greatest gift is just to be there. The man who walked away, winter's breath softened the world. Snow fell like whispered prayers, settling on rooftops and branches, muffling the noise of the world. The quiet man walked through a small town wrapped in white, his footprints the only disturbance on the frozen sidewalks. He came to a community center where people gathered for warmth and company. Inside, children laughed and elders shared stories like seeds planting hope. He sat in the corner, silent and still. A young girl with bright eyes approached him. "Are you a wizard?" she asked. He smiled. "No," he said softly, "just someone who listens." She sat beside him, and together they watched the world unfold in gentle light. Later, the townspeople gathered outside, lighting lanterns for the night festival. The quiet man stood among them, a single lantern in his hands. He released it slowly, watching it rise, small and bright against the dark sky. A hush fell over the crowd, and as the lantern floated upward, it carried not just light, but a blessing. May all beings find peace. As the lantern disappeared into the stars, the man turned and began walking again. No destination, no farewell, just the soft rhythm of footsteps on snow. He walked toward the horizon, where the world met sky, where silence spoke, and where presence was the greatest gift. And so his journey continued, not in places or stories, but in every quiet moment waiting to be noticed.